Hi, my name is Jeff H. Sipe, and I have over 10 years of recruiting experience, including 5 years at Google. In this video, I want to talk about my program management framework. And so this is definitely something I've chatted about before, but two really critical and important items have come up over the last few months and are really consistent themes. And so one, this framework can be used for any position, whether it's a program manager, a product manager, a software engineer, an analyst, an HR professional. And so, really reflecting and looking at any program or project, this can be really flexible. Secondly, this is really helpful for actually your behavioral examples because as you write down and get that behavioral example down, you'll want to reflect back and say, hey, am I covering all these components in my example? And it's just good exploratory methodology because you might have missed something that's in your framework, but it's not actually appearing in your examples. If you like my content, please like. If you have any comments, please comment below. And if you like my overall content, please subscribe. So item one is background. Without getting into too much detail, this framework was created over time. Talking with a lot of people and a lot of program managers, I have no formal program management experience, but these themes kept repeating over and over. And what I thought I developed over time was just this comprehensive framework that will act as a safety net in your interview, especially for open-ended questions. This is your fallback. You're going to want to go ahead and explore all these items, and it will always really create this safe place for you. Now, the depth and how far you go into these concepts really depends on the question and the circumstances. Item two, application. So when would you use this? And it's really, again, applying it for any type of question. Most commonly, you're going to use it for an open-ended question, but it will also cover behavioral examples. It just guarantees, again, that you're thinking about everything. And maybe all these concepts aren't right for you. This might really depend on personal needs and what you've experienced in your career, but just considering all of them is important. Lastly, the one other application piece I want you to really strongly be thinking about is order. Some of the concepts I'm going to mention today, they can come in different orders, but there are a couple that should come first and a couple that should come last, and just think logically about that order and what kind of order has worked well for you in your career. Item number three, considerations. This and any other framework will be impacted by countless items, but three specific items I really want you to focus on are one, new or existing. For program managers, it's very, very rare that you're stepping into something completely new. It's either something existing or it's a spin-off. And while you still want to consider all the items that are addressed here, this piece of data will impact how you approach your overall framework. Item two, business versus technical. What is the primary focus? Is it business related? Is it technical focused? Most often it will be both, but this will also impact how you utilize the framework. And then lastly and third is internal versus external. This really adds a layer of complexity when you have an external component. And so it's something that you'll need to evolve and be thinking about throughout the framework. If there's this external component of vendors, clients, etc., it's going to make it a little trickier, and you're going to want to add that in every step of the process. So let's dive in. Item 4, GHBTRRSSS. And you're going to want to work on your mnemonics, your naming conventions, whatever you want to call them for as you create frameworks. But this is the framework I created. You're going to want to adapt and adjust this depending on your background, your experiences, your skills, your passions, etc. So what does this actually stand for? G, goals and objectives. H, historical data. B, budget. T, timeline. R, resources. R, risk. S, scope and scale. S, stakeholders. And S, shared vision. Item 5, goals and objectives. Before we do anything, what are we trying to achieve? How does this align with the company objectives and company vision? We really have to start here, and the reasoning will dictate all future actions. There's really not a single instance where this item is not important. It will give us greater perspective and just make us more aligned on a path forward. Item 6, historical data. This is probably my favorite and the most forgotten and missed concept. And history teaches us everything. If we don't examine the past, the future is potentially a huge waste of time. You're going to want to go back and discover any historical information that you can access, including documentation, stakeholders and SMEs. Why would you create a program plan from scratch when Jane down the hall finished a similar program last week? You're going to go talk to Jane and find out every piece of information from her. You're going to find out who are the other people you should be talking to, what is the documentation you should be reviewing. And so, quick story, at Google, I used to interview a lot of recruiters, and the question I would ask them was to build a 50-person engineering office in a place that Google didn't already exist. And of all of those interviews, 50, 60, 70, however many it was, only one person ever mentioned looking at the history. We hired that person and she is still at Google today. And it just goes to show you how important that concept is. You want to start with goals and objectives, but connecting it to the historical data is critical. And those items should be the first two items you talk about. Item 7 is budget. How much you focus on this item is really up to you, but the first two concepts will impact the budget. And part of this focus, you may have a stronger focus if you're interviewing at a startup or a really small company, as opposed to maybe having less of a focus if you're interviewing at a big public company. But remember, everybody is going to be thinking about budget, and really you'll want to truly think about budget from a resourcing perspective, something we'll chat about in a minute. You also want to think about it from a quality perspective, and sometimes, honestly, shipping is more important than having great quality. Lastly, just building in budget contingencies and reserves to navigate that ambiguity, because you're not always going to know everything, and so you have to build in a little bit of a plan there. Item 8 is timeline. And timeline is directly correlated with budget. They go hand in hand, and I actually like to introduce them back to back for good flow. How much time will impact every other item in this framework? So think about timeline from the planning stage to launch stage to completion stage. Really, you want to look at it holistically. Item number 9, resources. Surprisingly, this item is skipped over far too often. And when you think about resources, think about it from a tools perspective and then a people perspective. So tools could just be how you navigate systems. Do you have the right systems and tools in place? And then from a people perspective, you're thinking about subject matter experts, you're thinking about stakeholders. And it's really critical. Sometimes you can't get a previous stakeholder that you think is critical to moving this program forward. Sometimes you need a critical SME for just a week, but they're overloaded, they're not available. So the resourcing component is critical. And then if you have this external component, sometimes a vendor has to deliver a hardware component, and they're going to be 2 weeks late on that delivery. So that external complexity piece is really, really important. And being appropriately resourced just leads to great success. And so you absolutely want to plan for that. And it's a pretty good segue into item 10, risk. This is one of my favorite topics if you've watched any of my videos, and this absolutely needs to be a part of your framework, because every aspect of the program will be impacted if you're not really truly assessing and looking at risk. So you have to look at the historical data. You have to identify and score the risk. You have to have that mitigation plan that's created with that shared vision. And just like some of the other components, you have to build in dependencies. Some risks are going to pop up that you didn't anticipate. You might score a risk at 3 and it becomes an 8 all of a sudden. So just addressing this item and showing that you recognize the importance of risk and the examination of risk, really, really critical to the success of a program manager or anybody in any role. Item 11, scope and scale. So we just really need to make sure in our goals and objectives we're getting into this bigger scope or scale piece. This is going to come up as we plan, as we determine requirements, we create the roadmap, etc. And the bigger the program or the project, the more scope and scale, the greater the complexity. So something that you always want to touch on, and something that most people will touch on in some component and do really well with that item. 12, stakeholders. And again, this is another item that most of my clients, candidates, it's something they're focused on because it's such a key component of success in any role. We have to be thinking about the other people involved and how those other people can help the entire company, you, etc., have success. So let's go back to those initial concepts, the big three that we talked about: new versus existing, business versus technical, and internal versus external. You want to leverage previous stakeholders as much as you can, but also make sure that you're bringing in the critical people to make sure that this program has success or this project has success. Business versus technical, a lot of times it's really about getting the right people on board and aligned. And I'm not a technical person, so I always am thinking straight to technical. Who can I bring in from a technical perspective that's going to up my skill set in that area because it's not a strength of mine? And then internal versus external. As you think about this complexity, remember you can't share all the details typically of somebody who's external. Like there's just a lot of moving pieces with this external item. So as you're talking about this framework, it's why it's so critical. The complexity level of bringing in somebody from the outside or multiple vendors, etc. It just makes it a little tougher. So I want you to be exploring these three items again when you talk about stakeholders. And I think it's pretty common sense how important they are. And it's a great segue into item 13, shared vision. I like ending with this one because you've put all the components together, and this truly becomes the last step because these are the agreed upon and documented goals and outcomes, and you're really working towards an overall alignment and achieving something together. And these items can be revisited, addressed again, restructured throughout the process. And lastly, hopefully part of this shared vision is creating documentation for the future. So as you're going through it, you're documenting it and kind of finalizing what happened. And that really starts with this fundamental agreement and then going all the way to the end of the process and making sure that people can utilize it again in the future. So as you're preparing for your interview, I just want you to be thinking about these frameworks. Think about all these topics that we discussed and ask yourself, are any of these topics not important? Because I ask myself that question all the time. And as I go through this and continue to go through this, I add, I adapt, I adjust them a little bit, like the goals and objectives piece. I added that recently. I didn't have that in the last video that I created touching on this subject, but it just kept coming up and I felt like, wow, yeah, I'm really missing that component. Ask yourself, if I was to answer a vague question or a very specific scenario or hypothetical based question, would I want to explore these items? And most of the time the answer is yes. You probably want to explore all of them in the amount of time that you have, knowing that you want to be very, very strategic. But if you just utilize this framework to not only think about how you answer open-ended questions, but how you're looking at your behavioral examples and making sure that you're talking through every important component, every important piece, I really think it will help. It's helped me a lot in working with clients, and it's helped my clients a lot get their answers more structured and just more organized and acted as this safety net. When we get these crazy questions in interviews and they stress us out and we don't feel prepared, we can always fall back on this particular framework. Really hope this helps. Thanks.